1995, I preached for a very small congregation on the north side of the Fort Worth area, Tarrant County area, up close to Azle. I mean, I'm talking small, like on a real good day, maybe 15 members. And I was living in Grand Prairie at the time. And that was a 60-mile drive one way to that place. And we had a Thursday night Bible study instead of a Wednesday night. And one Thursday night, I drove all the way out there and nobody showed up. There was nobody there. So I gave my lesson anyway to an empty building and just left. So, yeah, I needed the practice. So that has happened. That's the only time that's happened. But it was made up of mostly elderly members and others that, you know, if one or two got sick, most of the congregation was gone, you know, and some of the older ones wouldn't drive at night and such. Job chapter 32 is where we are. Job chapter 32. We're going to try to get through verses 32 to 37 as we look at Elihu's speech. He is a newcomer to the pages of Job. And before we get into this, I'd like to ask Matt if he would direct our thoughts in a word of prayer. Amen. Job chapter 32 through chapter 37 is a long speech from Elihu. Now, Job stopped his speech in chapter 31. Chapter 31 of Job is the ending of Job's speech and therefore the end of a cycle, so to speak. This is the beginning of a new section in chapter 32 through 37 of Job, in which Elihu is speaking. And we're probably going to focus more on chapter 36 and 37 as Elihu talks about God and His majesty and such. But we're looking here at Job, and we're seeing Elihu is a newcomer. He is a fourth person who has kept silent during all of this back and forth between the three friends and Job. Look at chapter 32 and verse 1. And you look at verse 40 of chapter 31. It says, "And the words of Job are ended." And that shows you that's the end of that section. Chapter 32 and verse 1, "So these three men ceased answering Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. Then the wrath of Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite of the family of Ram, was aroused against Job. His wrath was aroused because he justified himself rather than God. Also against his three friends, his wrath was aroused because they had found no answer and yet had condemned Job." So here you have a newcomer. But he's been there the whole time, it seems to indicate. He's a newcomer to the discussion, but he's been there the whole time listening. And we're going to see why he spoke up at the very end. Look at verse 4. "Now because they were years older than he, Elihu had waited to speak to Job. When Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these three men, his wrath was aroused." So he was the youngest of the group that was there to visit Job. And he, out of respect for them, waited to the end to speak. There's something to be said about the young respecting adult conversation and older conversation and not interrupting. I try to teach my children all the time, when adults are speaking, you do not interrupt them. When mom and daddy are speaking, you don't interrupt them, and we'll talk to you when the conversation is ended. There's a respect there that needs to be instilled in young people, that you don't interrupt adults when they're speaking. And there's this concept here with Elihu, that he kept silent towards and then waited for that opportunity to speak, and now he's going to speak. But like the other three friends, He's going to talk about God's righteousness and God's dealings with men, and he's going to say some right things but misapply them to Job. And he speaks up in verses 2 through 5, and you see that he waits till the friends have ended, and then he's going to speak up. Verse 6, so Elihu the son of Barachel, the Buzite, answered and said, I am young in years, and you are very old. Therefore I was afraid and dared not declare my opinion to you. So he was respecting the fact that they were older. Leviticus 19 and verse 32 talks about how that when an older person comes in, you're to stand up. A respect for those who are older. That's something that we need to instill within God's people today. Verse 7, I said, age should speak, and the multitude of years should teach wisdom. But there is a spirit in man, and the breath of the Almighty gives him understanding. Great men are not always wise, nor do the aged always understand justice. Now, what he's saying here is this. I was waiting for you to speak up and to say what needs to be said. But I found out that that's not always the case, that great men and aged men have wisdom and understanding. Now, all of us could probably say that we have seen in our life people who are older who make some of the poorest decisions and say some of the dumbest things that you'll ever hear. And they ought to know better. They ought to know better as far as their decision making. They ought to know better concerning other things. And yet they behave in such a way and they say things in such a way that it's just their behavior shows that they don't have the wisdom that their years should have given them, their experience. With experience comes wisdom, but only if the person is willing to accumulate that wisdom and to use it for God's glory. And so I've seen people, of course, I've seen plenty of people who are older and wise, and because of their ability to make application to their life from God's Word and to make proper decisions, they've set forth a good example. And so that is a general rule among Christians that you find that, but then there's exceptions to that rule, and too often times there's a lot of exceptions to that as when it comes to people who are older but they don't have wisdom. Verse 10, therefore I say, listen to me, I will also declare my opinion. Indeed, I waited for your words, I listened to your reasonings while you searched out what to say. Verse 12, I paid close attention to you, and surely not one of you convinced Job or answered his words. He said, I listened to you carefully, what you said to Job, and you didn't convince Job or answer his words. Verse 13, lest you say, we have found wisdom, God will vanquish him, not man. Now he has not directed his words against me, so I will not answer him with your words. In verse 15 he goes on to say, they are dismayed and answer no more. Words escape them. They don't know what to say. They've said all this, but they don't know what to say. And then Elihu says there in verse 16, and I have waited because they did not speak, because they stood still and answered no more. So he was waiting for that opportunity. He wasn't going to interrupt them. He was going to wait for that opportunity. Verse 17, I also will answer my part. I too will declare my opinion. For I am full of words, and my spirit within me compels me. Indeed, my belly is like wine that has no vent. It is ready to burst the new wineskins. What's he saying here? I'm about to burst. I want to say something. I've got to say something. And he's using, of course, symbolism to denote that I'm about to burst. When they would ferment wine, of course, intoxicating wine is under consideration there. They would put it in wineskins that would expand, and they would put vents in it so the gases in the fermentation process could escape. And he's saying this is sealed up, and I'm like that. It's just the pressure is building up. I've got to say something now. You ever been in a situation like that where it's time to say something? You've listened long enough. You've heard it all. Nothing's getting done. Nothing's being accomplished. It's time to say something. And that's what Elihu is saying here. He says, I will speak that I may find relief. I must open my lips and answer. Let me not, I pray, show partiality to anyone, nor let me flatter any man. For I do not know how to flatter, else my Maker would soon take me away. So he's saying, I want to talk about this. I want to discuss this situation with Job. But then he goes on to say, I don't want to show partiality, nor do I want to use flattery. He's saying, I want to be fair. I don't want to show partiality to anyone, and I do not want to use flattery. What is flattery? Right. False words, false compliments. It's usually to take advantage of that person, usually to gain an advantage. You see this a lot in election years when the politicians are out and they're flattering one another and such. That he says, I don't want to have any part of that. I want to be impartial. And that's a good attitude to have. We should be impartial when we evaluate a situation, and one way of doing that is taking our emotions out of the equation, which is not always easy to do, especially when you're dealing with family. But when you're trying to deal with someone, taking those emotions out of the equation to try to deal with someone in a particular situation, especially if the situation could be volatile, it could be something that is not going to turn out good. We should show no partiality, and we should not show favoritism to one person simply because they're maybe related to us or whatever. We should be fair. God shows no partiality. Acts chapter 10, Peter finally realized, I have a truth now I know, God shows no partiality. He's not a respecter of persons. But in every nation, anyone who fears God and works righteousness is accepted by Him. Peter had to learn that lesson, that God does not favor one group of people over the other as far as a race is concerned. Christ died for everyone. And so he had to learn that. Well, Elihu is talking about that. He doesn't want to use flattery. He says, he says, for if I do not know how to flatter, else my Maker would soon take me away. He says, I haven't learned how to flatter because I know that I'm held accountable to God. I'm held accountable to God for what I do in this situation. So what you find here in chapter 32 is the introduction of Elihu. And he's upset with Job because Job justified himself rather than God in his view of things. He's upset with the friends because they provide no real answers and yet condemn Job. They don't have any real answers or solutions, but they want to condemn Job. And he had waited to speak because of his youth, but the silence from the three men made him angry. He was ready to speak up at that time. So we see here that Job wants to speak up, Elihu wants to speak up and say some things to try to be, to have some input into the situation with Job. He believes, chapter 33, he believes that he can help Job. He speaks pure knowledge from an upright heart, verses 1 through 3 of Job 33. He pleads with Job to listen to him. Job 33 and verse 1. But please, Job, hear my speech and listen to my words. So he wants to instruct Job and talk to him, and he's saying, listen to what I have to say. And then he speaks about how that he's going to speak, and he wants to speak in a way that is pure. Verse 33, my words come from my upright heart. My lips utter pure knowledge. Verse 4, the Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life. If you can answer me, set your words in order before me, take your stand. Truly I am as your spokesman before God. I also have been formed out of clay. Surely no fear of me will terrify you, nor will my hand be heavy on you. Now, he's talking about in verse 2, opening his mouth to speak his words. What is verse 3 saying? Job 33 and verse 3. What does that mean? Wanting to do right. The upright heart there. My lips utter pure knowledge. In other words, he's got the best intent in mind. Sincerity, that's a word that comes to mind. He only wants to help the situation. He's already said he doesn't want to use flattery. He already said he doesn't want to be to show partiality. So he said, I have the best intent in mind there. Verse 4, he talks about how the Spirit of God had made him, and the breath of the Almighty gives him life. He's of course, hearkening back to Genesis chapter 2 and verse 7. God formed man out of the dust of the ground, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. And so he's basically saying, look, I'm a human being created in the image of God. And he says to Job, if you can answer me, set your words in order before me and take your stand. He's wanting Job to respond to him. But notice what he says in verse 6 and 7. He wants to have a dialogue with Job. When he says there in verse 6, truly I am as your spokesman before God. I also have been formed out of clay. Clay, of course, is referring to the dust of the ground. He's a creature. He's saying, I'm a human being like you. And so what does he mean there in verse 7? Surely no fear of me will terrify you, nor will my hand be heavy on you. What does that mean? Right.
So maybe he's trying to say, I know I'm young, but listen to me, I guess, is the kind of way I take it.
Right. And I think that is it. I think he's saying, I'm a human being just like you are, and I'm not going to be hard on you. Right. Surely no fear of me will terrify you. I'm not going to be hard on you to terrify you, nor will my hand be heavy on you. I'm not going to come on you heavy-handed. So he probably saw the heavy-handedness of the other three and said, I'm not going to approach it that way. And there are certain situations, and this is the study of Job is also a good study on how to help people and deal with people who are facing tragedy and difficulty in their life. You see, of course, bad examples. We've already seen bad examples of what the other three friends were asking, which was what? Job, what'd you do? You sinned. In fact, one of them said, I forgot which one, said, well, your sons must have sinned, your children must have sinned, that's why they're dead. Well, that's pretty heavy-handed. That's not how you deal with a situation like this. And so Elihu probably heard all that, and that's probably part of the reason why he got angry. Like, this is not how you handle this. This is totally the wrong way to handle this situation. I was at a funeral one time, and there was a lady there that was a friend of the the woman whose father passed away. And the woman whose father passed away, she, of course, after the funeral, we were talking with her, and the lady came up and said, "Oh, you look terrible. Have you not been sleeping?" And I just wanted to grab her up and said, "She just lost her father. She's probably been crying and up, That's not what you say at that time, It's like, what's going through your mind to say something like that? She's not there to win a beauty contest. Her father passed away. She's at her father's funeral. Of course she's going to look bad." So it's like, where is common sense? I thought, you think of the scripture, miserable comforters. That's something she didn't need to hear. And the lady, she had the best intent. I just don't get people sometimes. She was old enough to know better. But, you don't say stuff like that. And, and Elihu's probably heard the heavy-handedness, especially the condemnation the three friends were giving Job. "What did you do, Job? You must have done something. God punishes the wicked, therefore you must be wicked." So he said, "I'm not going to do that to you. I'm not going to do that to you." Beginning in verse 8, he talks about God's graciousness. He talks verses 8 through 33 of the really the remainder of the chapter. He tells Job that Job is wrong for charging God as his enemy, and tells him Elihu has heard Job profess his innocence while counting God as his enemy. And that's how Job was reacting to God. He didn't know why God was doing that to him, because he thought God was doing that to him. And he says, "This is not right, for God is greater than man and is not accountable to man." That's one of the points that's made there. Look at verse 12 of Job chapter 33. "Look in this, you are not righteous. I will answer you, for God is greater than man. Why do you contend with him? For he does not give an accounting of any of his words. For God may speak in one way or another, yet man does not perceive it." And he talks about the various ways in which God revealed himself, and of course in this time period, in the patriarchy period, in a dream and a vision in the night, when deep sleep falls upon men while slumbering on the beds, when he opens the ears of men and seals their instruction, in order to turn man from his deed and conceal pride from man. He keeps back his soul from the pit and his life from perishing by the sword. And so he's saying, look, God doesn't have to give an account to us. We're the ones that's going to have to give an account to God. But God has communicated with us. Hebrews chapter 1 tells us God in various times and in various ways spoke in times past by the prophets. Of course, in the New Testament, he speaks through his Son, as it's recorded in the New Testament. In the days of the patriarchy, which Job would have lived, he spoke to the head of the house, the patriarch. And he would give various dreams to various people. You find that in the book of Genesis. He spoke to Abraham. He spoke to Isaac. There's Jacob. He spoke to Jacob in a dream, spoke to Joseph in a dream, spoke to Pharaoh in a dream, and Joseph interpreted it. So you have those various ways that God spoke in times past. And that's what Elihu is talking about here. The various ways. And the point of it is, the various reason why God has spoken to mankind is to deliver him from the pit and to restore his soul back from perishing, there in verse 18. God speaks to get us to be on the right path, to show us what the right path is. And that's what the Bible is for us today, is God's voice to us to say, this is the behavior that you're supposed to have. This is what you're supposed to do. Here's what you're supposed to avoid. And by doing so, we have a right relationship with God. And so on throughout the rest of the chapter there, God's purpose is sometimes to discipline and to help correct those that He's speaking to. Done to direct man away from the pit, to enlighten man concerning the light of life. And at the end of the chapter, he says, therefore, Job should listen to what Elihu is teaching him. He says in verse 31, give ear, Job, listen to me. Hold your peace, and I will speak. If you have anything to say, answer me. Speak, for I desire to justify you. If not, listen to me. Hold your peace, and I will teach you wisdom. So he's wanting to help the situation. He's wanting to help out Job with the problem that Job has. Any questions or comments before we go into chapter 34? I don't either.
I'm surprised that Elihu being so bold.
Mm-hmm.
If I happen to say something like that, if I happen to say that to mom or dad or anyone else, chances are they wouldn't accept it too well.
Right.
I don't know, it's just...
Well, the circumstances around it is something that Elihu thinks he needs to speak up. And I don't think he's being disrespectful. I think he's being bold, like you said. I think he sees this is that you've got it all wrong. Now, let's talk about it. And he waited to the end to do this out of respect for those who were older, and is now going to talk about these things. Chapter 34, he talks about how God is just. And he proclaims God's justice in chapter 34. He calls upon Job and his friends to listen to him. He rebukes Job in chapter 34 for charging God with taking away his justice and for saying that it does not profit man to delight in God. Of course, Job is speaking out of his sorrow when he says such things. He proclaims that God is righteous in chapter 34 and just in his dealings with man. He's always been righteous and just in his dealings with men. Far be it from God to do wickedness and pervert justice. In his power, God shows no partiality, but repays man according to his works. You find that throughout chapter 34 as he's talking about God's justice. And the things that he's saying, of course, are correct. God doesn't do wickedness. He doesn't pervert justice. God is always doing that which is righteous. And we should not charge God with taking away justice because God operates in perfect justice. Then in chapter 35, we have Elihu condemns Job's reasoning. Well, look at chapter 35. I was looking at the wrong one. Look at chapter 34 and verse 37. Let's go back to verse 34 through 37 of chapter 34. Men of understanding say to me, wise men who listen to me, Job speaks without knowledge, his words are without wisdom. Oh, that Job were tried to the utmost, because his answers are like those of a wicked men. For he adds rebellion to his sin, and he claps his hands among us and multiplies his words against God. So it seems here that Elihu is operating under the same misunderstanding as the three friends. He adds rebellion to his sin. So that goes back to the whole concept of Job, what did you do to have this happen to you? So Elihu thinks he's helping the situation, but he's not. He's not really doing it because he's, again, coming from the same faulty premise, the faulty concept that if disaster strikes, you must have done something to make God angry. And as long as they have that understanding, they're going to misapply these concepts about God. Now, chapter 35, Elihu condemns Job's reasoning. He says he reproves Job for thinking righteousness does not profit one. He claims that God is too great to be manipulated by man's little deeds. He contends that God may not respond to the cries for help because of man's pride. And he counsels Job to be patient and wait for God's justice, for Job has been speaking prematurely and foolishly. Now, on that issue, he is a little bit correct. Because remember what Job has been wanting the whole time. I want an audience with God so I can present my case before Him, and I want Him to answer me. Remember when we looked at those passages and we said Job's getting a little bit big for his britches here. He's getting a little bit big for his britches. And so Elihu is right about that. He needs to be patient and wait for God. Now, beginning in chapter 6, we're going to look at this a little bit more, chapter 6 and chapter 36 and chapter 37. And then we're going to end that section and save chapter 38 for next week, Lord willing, because that gets into where God answers. God speaks now. God is going to have His say. Now look at chapter 36 and verse 1. Elihu also proceeded and said, "Bear with me a little, and I will show you that there are yet words to speak on God's behalf." So he's speaking some things on God's behalf. And notice this, in all of this, it's Elihu speaking. From chapter 32 all the way through chapter 37, it's all Elihu. Job is not speaking anything else. The other three are not speaking anything else. Verse 3, it says, "I will fetch my knowledge from afar. I will ascribe righteousness to my Maker. For truly my words are not false. One who is perfect in knowledge is with you." So he is saying, I've thought this through, and I want to share this with you. Verse 5, "Behold, God is mighty, but despises no one. He is mighty in strength of understanding." He's going to talk about God's greatness in chapter 36 and chapter 37. Now notice verse 5 there of Job 36. God is mighty, but He despises no one. Mighty. He's powerful, but He doesn't abuse His power. That's what he's saying there. He's mighty in strength and of understanding. He does not preserve the life of the wicked, but gives justice to the oppressed. Now this is, of course, big picture verses talking about ultimately what will happen. God doesn't preserve the life of the wicked. They're going to meet their demise, but gives justice to the oppressed. Verse 7. "He does not withdraw His eyes from the righteous, but they are on the throne with kings. For He has seated them forever, and they are exalted." And so that seems to indicate the big picture, the ultimate victory that all those who serve God will have. Because we know in this life sometimes that's not always the case. Verse 8, "And if they are bound in fetters, held in the cords of affliction, then He tells them their work and their transgression, that they have acted defiantly." He warns, He tells, here's what your behavior is. It's defiance. Verse 10, "He also opens their ears to instruction and commands that they turn from iniquity." What's that? Repentance. God has always demanded repentance. Patriarchal period, Mosaic period, and in our period, the Christian era, He has always demanded people to repent of their sins. They have to turn from iniquity. He commands them to turn from iniquity. Verse 11, "If they obey and serve Him, they shall spend their days in prosperity and their years in pleasure. But if they do not obey, they shall perish by the sword, and they shall die without knowledge." So there again, there's the big picture. You serve God, you're going to be blessed. You're going to do what's right. And if you don't, you're going to be devoured by the sword. Now, ultimately that's true. But do you think that Elihu may think that that's how it is? And here's the problem with Job. Look at the calamity that's come upon you, Job. Remember, they're saying some right things about God, but they're misapplying it to Job. And so he's saying there, if you serve and obey him, you'll prosper. Well, yes, there's many ways that you prosper as you serve and obey God. But what it seems like he's saying, if you do not obey, you shall perish by the sword and you'll die without knowledge. It seems to me that he's saying, look, if these bad things happen to you, then you fall into the category of verse 12. But that's not the case with Job. Now, generally speaking, in the ultimate big picture of things, it is true. The righteous will prosper. The wicked will be punished. That's the big picture. But sometimes in this life, the righteous have to endure suffering, and the wicked, they live on cloud 9. But their day is coming. So, as far as what Elihu is saying here, it is true ultimately, but there are exceptions in this life. I mean, think about dying young. Did not Jesus die young? Was he not like about 33 years old when he was crucified? That's considered a young man. He never sinned, though. Never violated the will of God. He was killed. But there was part of God's plan. But there is an example of a young man dying and was killed by wicked men. So there are exceptions to that in this life. But in the next life, we know that is the way things are. Look at verse 13. But the hypocrites in heart store up wrath. They do not cry for help when he binds them. The hypocrite is storing up wrath. They're going to face God's wrath. They die in youth, and their life ends among the perverted persons. He delivers the poor in their affliction and opens their ears in oppression. So again, he's talking about those who are wicked. They die in youth, and their life ends among the perverted person. Sometimes that happens because of wickedness. Some people live in rebellious attitudes toward God, and they die in their youth as a result of that. But that's not always the case in this life. Verse 16, indeed, he would have brought you out of dire distress into a broad place where there is no restraint, and what is set on your table would be full of riches, but you are filled with the judgment due the wicked. Ah, you see that? You're getting what you deserve, Job. See? He's saying the same thing that the three friends said. Now, he thought he had something different to say. He thought he had something to add to it. They don't have it figured out. Now, let me come in, let me put my 2 cents in, and lo and behold, his 2 cents are the very same thing as the other three were saying. I'll show you wisdom, and it's the same thing basically what the other three were saying. Indeed, he would have brought you out of dire distress, and God will do that at the end of the book, into a broad place where there is no restraint, and what is set on your table would be full of riches. Again, if you prosper, you must be right with God. That's that misconception. But you are filled with the judgment due the wicked. Judgment and justice take hold of you. Because there is wrath, beware lest he take you away with one blow, for a large ransom would not help you avoid it. You can't buy your way out of this situation, Job. That's basically what he's saying. Will your riches, or verse 19, or all the mighty forces keep you from distress? Can you buy your way out of God's wrath? Do not desire the night when people are cut off in their place. Take heed, do not turn to iniquity, for you have chosen this rather than affliction. Behold, God is exalted by his power. Who teaches like him? Well, before we get into verse 22, again, verse 16 through 21, he's basically saying the same thing as the other three said. That you've done something to make God very angry at you, and that is why this has come upon you. And so, You need to face that. Verse 22, behold, God is exalted by His power. So beginning there in verse 22, you see how that he's going to, again, say some things about God that are absolutely correct. But, of course, he has it misapplied to Job's situation. Behold, God is exalted by His power. Who teaches like Him? Who has assigned Him His way, or has said, you have done wrong? Of course, no one can do that. Everything God does is right. Everything God says is correct. Verse 24, remember to magnify His work, of which men have sung. Everyone has seen it. Man looks on it from afar. People have talked about His works. They've sung about His works. He's saying there. Look at verse 26. Behold, God is great, and we do not know Him, nor can the number of His years be discovered. Of course, that's accommodative language. God doesn't have number of years. He's eternal. Psalm 90 and verse 2, from everlasting to everlasting. So we see here God is great. We don't know Him. Only thing we can know about Him is what He's revealed in His Word. And of course, there's many secret things that only belong to Him. Deuteronomy 29:29. Verse 27, He draws up... Now this is interesting. This is scientific foreknowledge in the Bible. He draws up drops of water which distill as rain from the midst, which the clouds drop down and pour abundantly on man. He's talking about evaporation there. Now there's no way Elihu would have known about evaporation. That's something that has recently been discovered as to how the clouds become clouds. I mean, they're droplets of water and ice crystals suspended in the atmosphere, but it's because of evaporation, the water cycle. That's exactly what he's talking about here. And he's talking about God in natural providence and natural law. This is what He does. And he's going to go on from this point on through chapter 37 and talk about God's power and nature. And it's very interesting, and when we get into chapter 38, which we just don't have time to do tonight, we don't even have time to get into 37 much at all, God is going to take that vantage point of nature and ask Job these series of questions about the natural realm. And we'll get into that part next week, Lord willing. But he's talking about here the water cycle. He draws up drops of water, which distill as rain from the midst. Draws up drops of water. Is that something you can observe? Not generally. You can't see. Maybe you can see sometimes steam coming up when it's cold outside. You can see the mist coming up off the water. But generally, you don't see that water going up in evaporation. This shows, again, that God is the author of this book because God is the one who created this. This is scientific foreknowledge. And Elihu knew about this to some extent because of what God has revealed. And it says, verse 29, indeed, can anyone understand the spreading of the clouds, the thunder from His canopy? Look, He scatters His light upon it and covers the depths of the sea. For by these He judges the peoples and gives food in abundance. He covers His hands with lightning and commands it to strike. His thunder declares it, the cattle also concerning the rising storm. He's talking about the weather cycle here. And he talks of, can anyone understand the spreading of the clouds? Well, we got meteorologists who try to figure that out every single day and try to forecast the weather. And that's exactly what he's talking about here, the weather cycle. Can we understand that? No, we've just barely begun to understand that in our 21st century. He scatters light upon it and covers the depths of the sea. It's very interesting, verse 30, when you look at how our atmosphere is, that when sunlight shines on it, it is dispersed. That's why there is a glow in our atmosphere. That's why there is a blue sky. Sunlight is dispersed in our atmosphere so that it covers a vast area. You know, if you go to the moon, there's no atmosphere on the moon. You have light and pitch dark and a shadow on the moon. There's no dispersing of the light. Because even in a shadow here, you can see things. When the sun's out, you see a shadow. Well, that light's dispersed everywhere. You go to the moon, shadow is cast by a crater or a rock, it's pitch black because there's no dispersing of the light. God's wisdom in creating our world. And that's what he's talking about. The light is dispersed. Can anyone understand the spreading of the clouds, the scattering of his light upon it? Verse 31, by these he judges the peoples and gives food in abundance. The fruitful seasons, Acts 14 and verse 17, Paul and Barnabas talk about that. The fruitful, he's done good. He's given us fruitful seasons. We're getting a lot of rain. We prayed for rain. We're getting a lot of rain now. What was it, August? We were in a severe drought. Now the Lord's blessing us with an abundance of rain. Verse 32, he covers his hand with lightning and commands it to strike. Again, talking about the weather system and the lightning. And his thunder declares it. The cattle also concerning the rising storm. It's very interesting in verse 33 that I read one commentary. It talks about how that the people that deal with animals and cattle, the animals know when a storm's coming. Animals know. And so the people that before, of course, the 20th century and the advent of radios and warning devices like radios, televisions, and things like that, weather scanners, they'd watch the animals. The animals start acting funny, something's about to happen. And so that's how God made them. Well, time is up. Chapter 37, be studying chapter 37 and go into chapter 38. And we'll cover those two chapters next week, Lord willing.